is freezing, it is cold, and so I thought I would warm my cold little heart with a lot of books that would actually just make me more sad. So hi, thank you for clicking on this video. This is gonna be the wrap up of January. So, starting off, I don't know if it's strong. We started off Fable and Namesake by Adrienne Young. This is a YA fantasy duology. It's this initial dive into this bigger world that Adrienne Young is building. And I don't know if I like the world or not. I like the idea of the world. It's very like pirate, gritty. It's about a girl named Fable who is sort of like a deep sea diver. And she lives on this island with a bunch of like rough, tough, piratey kind of people. And she was abandoned there by her father, which frankly was pretty rude. And so she is trying to make enough money to get passage so that she can go and like confront the family and be like, what was that about? Why did you leave me on this island with all of these like violent criminals for all this time? And that's about all that I can say without spoiling it. There's some romance. Put me in, coach, every time. I want to like it more than I actually do. Like, I really love the idea of like gray morality but I also just like want them to be nice to each other, and I want them all to just be happy and to stop arguing. So that always just like when a lot of a book is like people arguing or people like making decisions that are gonna come back to hurt them stresses me out, but also in the best way. But it's not super heavy in like magic and powers and all that kind of stuff. So if you need a break from your classic, YA girl with no chest finds out she has powers, and this might be good for you. So, Fable and Namesake by Adrienne Young. I love Adrienne Young. We'll get there. Next up, get the tissues. Get them. Literally stop and go get a box of tissues right now in just preparation. I don't know, for reading this, but you don't have it with you, so maybe just like order them. Okay, so next I read As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow, and if you're an avid reader, this book probably is on your radar. It is, I don't want to say historical fiction because it's actively happening right now, but it is about the conflict in Syria, and it is so good. I just need you to go read this book. And I'm someone who's often feels a little daunted by historical fiction. It's about a young woman in Syria, and her whole family has really been affected by the violence there. And she's like a pharmacy student. She is not a doctor. She just wants to be a pharmacist. She likes herbs, all this stuff. And in Syria, they're really targeting really vulnerable people, and they're also targeting doctors. And so she is kind of promoted into this really high position really early on in her career. She's like very young. And she is currently living with her sister-in-law, who's also like her bestie. Like they grew up together and then kind of became family. And her sister-in-law is pregnant, which is also a target population. And so a lot of it's her experiencing what's happening in the hospital that she works at. And just like she meets a boy, and it is the loveliest romance. It is so, like, this book is really, really heavy. But the romance, just like, it still, you were able to find joy in the romance. And I think that was just like so beautifully done. It's very easy to read. I think I read it in a day, and I finished it at like 3 a.m. and it was like 2. It wasn't that late, okay? And the next day, I like right away went to the gym in the morning, and I like had not really processed. And so I was just sitting at the gym just like in a state of sadness and just like contemplation. And it just is really, really well done. So highly recommend this one, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow. I know I'm not alone in loving this book. Next, another Adrienne Young. So this is The Girl the Sea Gave Back. And this one's kind of tricky, and I kind of want to talk about a different book because it is a sequel to a book called The Sky and the Deep. This takes place about, I would say, like 10 years after The Sky and the Deep. So I can't really tell you very much about most of it because it spoils what happens in The Sky and the Deep. It starts off with this like sacrificial boat, it seems. This girl being like sent into the ocean, like the people have sacrificed her and she's dead and they're floating her across the water, right? And she has these tattoos all over her that she had when she was born. She's like the truth teller of the people of their clan. So then they kind of use her in that way. And it's a dual perspective book. So that's one of the perspectives. And the other one is a character from The Sky and the Deep. And the problem I had with it was I loved The Sky and the Deep so much that I really just wanted to get to those characters, but they weren't the main characters, right? This is always what happens with these types of things where it's like, I just am here for the cameo of the other characters, and if they weren't in play, it would be a lot easier for me to get invested in her story. So I think I would have liked it better had it not been so connected to the other one, but also disconnected. It was like, it was a sequel, but it wasn't a sequel. So, and it's like Adrienne Young. If you are just getting into fantasy, read some Adrienne Young. Next up I read Finley Donovan Knocks Him Dead. So this is the second book in the Finley Donovan series, and I'm just going to tell you about the series in general, because otherwise I'll get into spoiler territory. It's about this author who's like a single mom. She's got 2 really little kids. Her life is in chaos. It's like that opening to like an early 2000s movie where like the alarm clock's going off and the toast is burning and you're running around and your kids pooped their diaper, like one of those. And she is struggling to write her book, and she's meeting with her agent at a Kemmerer or something. They're having this conversation. And then the agent leaves and she's sitting there and someone comes up to her and like thinks that she's a contract killer because whatever they were talking about, like the language they used was very vague and it was not clear that they were talking about a book. It sounded like they were talking about like a murder deal. And so this woman comes up and offers her like all this money to like kill her husband or something or kill this man. And she's like, but it's so funny, but it also, the stakes are really high. But it also is so funny. And she has this nanny who like sort of becomes the like guy in the chair. She kind of pushes Finley into doing all these things and helps her get out of them also. So this is the second book. I really loved it. Just like, I read it on a plane. I think I read it in like 1 or 2 sittings. It's just very fun. If you need something to kind of get away a little bit, it's funny, but it's also like you can get invested in the stakes of it. Because I think a lot of times if I'm looking for something lighthearted, I think about like a rom-com, but oftentimes those don't hold my attention so much because it's like, well, I know they're gonna be together. But this is like, the stakes are really high, but also it's hilarious. I just started reading the 3rd one too, and it's starting off great. Highly recommend these ones. Okay, next up, I read Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. And this was recommended by, actually, most of these are recommended by the YouTube channel Carrie Can Read. I just really like her taste in books, and this is like her favorite book. She talks about it all the time. And I liked it. I did not like love it as much as I've heard people loving it. I found the prose to be a little flowery, honestly. And I know some people really, really love that. And it's just not what I value the most. It was very vibey. Like, it starts off in this library. She like has lived in this library her whole life. All the books are like magical and she's like the keeper of the books and all this stuff. And then there's this crime that happens in the library and she gets accused of the crime and like essentially has to be transported from the library where she's really only been there her whole life to like the main sorcery area, the city. And sorcery is very much like, all sorcerers are evil, like we don't like the sorcerers, they can choke, they are violent and horrible, and they're all gonna kill us. And so she has to be transported by a sorcerer. So it's obviously very scary for her. I liked a lot of things about it. It just, the way that the plot went, I didn't love. It was a lot about trying to like bring people back from the dead. And that's just not my favorite theme to read about, but the romance was very lovely and the writing was good. I just like, it was a little flowery for me. This book's like almost 500 pages and I feel like it could have been a little bit shorter. If you're looking for a standalone fantasy, Sorcery of Thorns. Then I read a trilogy, starting with A Curse So Dark and Lonely. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. It's maybe a little similar to another book series. It's actually interesting because a lot of fantasy that I've been reading recently, it fully takes place in the fantasy world. It's not like Harry Potter or other books where it's like, there's the normal world too, and you get pulled into this magic world. A lot of them have just been like purely contained in the magic world. And this one was this girl, she's living in DC, and she kind of gets sucked into this world to kind of be a Belle in a Beauty and the Beast kind of a situation. There's a curse and there's a prince and he needs to break the curse by falling in love, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and one thing that I thought was really interesting is after the first one, more characters become the main characters, if that makes sense. So the first one, it's really about this couple, right? This girl and this prince. And then in the second book, we get kind of some new characters introduced, and also the focus kind of shifts to this larger narrative about like this, and then it becomes more like that encompassing fantasy world where it's kind of unconnected to the real world. And I really liked the direction that it went. It took me a little bit of time to get on board with it because the perspective that the first book is told in is not even really in the second book. I saw some criticism for it about what happens with a certain character's arc. But what I'll say about it is I like when a story doesn't make someone just like a perfect, flawless human being. I think that happens a lot of times, especially in fantasy, where the male is like a 300-year-old, the hottest guy you've ever seen, and he has all the powers of the world, and he had a dark past, but like he's still literally the best person, fae, vampire, whatever, on the planet, and never makes mistakes. Or if they make mistakes, it was for a good reason. There's a character who kind of goes through this arc who makes a lot of really bad mistakes. And there's a lot of people who will not forgive this character for that at all. And I actually really like the arc of it. I liked all the people we met and where they went. And another thing that I thought was interesting, or was really cool actually, is the main character has cerebral palsy. And I think I just have this like kind of stagnant image about what that kind of a person looks like, just from the few that I've met in my life. And this really challenged a lot of those stereotypes. So it was great to learn. And so that was a really nice addition, I thought too. Ooh, then I got really, I would say, reflective. So first up was Yolk by Mary H.K. Choi, and it's about these two sisters who are living in New York, but they're not really very close, and they don't really get along very well, and they're kind of in different points of life. So one sister is very like successful in her career, and the other sister's kind of struggling through school and just kind of in a very different state financially, but also in their lifestyle too. But it's really a story about these two sisters kind of taking on what life throws at them, and coming to terms with like their family and the way they grew up and their relationship to each other. It does cover some pretty heavy topics, specifically like disordered eating. What I will say is they're kind of thrown into the situation where they have to live together and deal with some pretty like harsh realities. It's very different from the life that I'm living. I read a lot of fantasy and a lot of like thrillers of people that like I don't expect to relate to them, and it's not really about that. It's more about escaping into this other world or this other story. And this was very just like a reflective piece about like this experience of these two women. It was a little difficult to connect, to like feel like it was realistic. But then I got to a point in the book where I was like, no, people do have these experiences and view this way of life this way. It was a nice little like window into this life that I don't live, and that's, I mean, I guess that's why we should read, right? So I do recommend it. It is pretty heavy, but also heartwarming. I don't know. It took me longer than it usually does to read this book. And then I read this book. I went to the library and I really did not intend to read this book because it really seemed very dark. It's called Find Her by Lisa Gardner, I believe. And I didn't even check it out because it was kind of in the middle of the day on a day where I didn't have anything else and I was just looking around. And then I saw this book and the premise was about this woman who had been like kidnapped for like more than a year, but it takes place after that, and it's about like her, like similar crimes are happening again and she wants to kind of get involved. And I could tell from the blurb on the back that it would cover some like pretty heavy topics. Like it was like a pretty intense and graphic kidnapping. And I really did not want to read it. This is gonna sound weird. But you know, as you do, I just pulled it out as I was reading it and I just like started reading the first page just to see like if I could get a sense of if it was gonna be that kind of a book. And when I tell you, I read the entire thing right there, standing in the library. It was like a 250-page book, maybe a little bit longer. And I did skip some of it. So I don't really know if I can actually say that I fully read this book, but I think I would say I read 80% of it. It just sucked me right in, and it wasn't as graphic as I thought it was going to be, but it was still like icky. It was a lot. It's also a book in a series of like a detective. So this detective is in the book, but is not the main character, but is like, I'm sure that there's a subplot that goes through all the books about this character. It was fine. I would not really say go out and read this. It was very much like I call them a dime a dozen thriller. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think it's when an author, what I consider this to be, is when an author like writes a certain kind of thriller and then keeps writing it. So like James Patterson has the Alex Cross series. Or I can honestly even see the Finlay Donovan series becoming this too, where it's this person and they solve this kind of crime and this is the sort of thing that happens and you can expect this sort of violence from it. And so I probably won't read any more of it, but I did sort of sit and read that whole thing in like 2 hours at the library. And so the last book I read in January is Almond. It is translated into English from, I believe, Korean. I'm gonna check on that actually. And it's about this young boy who was born with this brain condition, which essentially means he can't feel emotion. I've heard of something where you can't feel pain, like physical pain, like you can put your hand on a stove and it doesn't burn. But his is more, he doesn't understand emotion and how to correctly emotionally respond to things. So if someone were to like bully him, he wouldn't understand that he should be sad about it. Or if someone around him is crying because they're mourning something, he doesn't understand why they're sad or why they're having the reaction that they're having. He lives with his mom and his grandma, and they kind of are trying to help him train his mind to learn how to recognize emotion and how to like fake emotion and like what sort of reactions you should have to certain things. And then this is not a spoiler, it happens like on the first page. There is this really, really horrible tragic crime that happens that kind of leaves him without his family, his support system. So he's just kind of living on his own and can't really process the loss that he's had. And he kind of finds this found family, and it actually ends up being very sweet. It's pretty short. I would recommend it. It's just like a good kind of contemplative read. It's written from his point of view, so it's very like, this is what happened. These are the things that are happening. This is how it is, because he doesn't feel emotion. I feel like that could make you emotionally detached from it a little bit, but I actually enjoyed the way that it was told. I think it really aided to the story a lot. How was a month? This next month I've got a lot of thrillers kind of in my back pocket, so I'm excited to see where that goes. But in the meantime, I hope you're reading a lot of good books. I would love some recommendations. I kind of spent the last year getting back into reading, or the last 2 years getting back into reading, so I had a lot of the big series available to me, and now I've read most of them. But yeah, I hope you are reading and staying warm.